Ditha hadina pabuni, the bocasto MESKLA Brewyon Drudh, Ostis Genev Sove Berryman. Hello and welcome everyone to the MESKLA Brewyon Drudh podcasts, hosted by me, Sove Berryman. MESKLA Brewyon Drudh is a multi-platform project using sculpture making and conversation to explore contemporary Cornish cultural identity. Through workshops, podcasts, a symposium and an exhibition, the project invites people to share their experiences of identity and Cornwall, and their views on Cornish culture and its relationship to land, language, heritage, tourism, the Cornish diaspora and much, much more. These podcasts record conversations with guests whose research or lived experience touches on the project themes. The views, thoughts and opinions expressed are the speaker's own. All conversations are carried out with a spirit of generosity and openness, creating space for the discussions to twist and turn. And I'm very grateful to all who have taken part. In this fourth podcast, I'm joined by Dr Stephanie Pratt, Dakota and Anglo-American art historian, and Jowdy Davey, a Cornish cultural worker, dancer and musician. Stephanie is a member of the Dakota Nation and became the first cultural ambassador for her tribal council at the Crow Creek Dakota Reservation in South Dakota, USA in 2015. She is a member of the Grandmothers Society based at Fort Thompson, South Dakota, which promotes the understanding and preservation of Dakota and Lakota culture and language. Her book, American Indians in British Art 1700 to 1840, was a first study of its kind. And currently she's working on a second book, which will examine how native North Americans made images of those who came to their lands and how those newcomers imaged native North Americans in turn. Jowdy is a director of Lowender Peran, with a young family dominated by powerful females growing up to understand and celebrate their own dual Breton Cornish heritage. Jowdy has recently led the commission of an exercise mapping Cornwall's intangible cultural heritage, identifying where support is needed for traditions and, most importantly, the communities that bear them to thrive. Ditha and welcome to Jowdy Davey and Dr Stephanie Pratt. Thank you both so much, Miraz, for joining me here for another MESKLA podcast. If you would like to introduce yourselves briefly for our listeners, that would be wonderful. Steph, would you?
Petu ashte. Imachiape washichu, Stephanie Pratt. Imachiape Dakota, Iokbewi. Mira wakantwa ka hantawana hemacha chante washte chiujapi. I want to thank all of you here, and thanks Sove and Jowdy and those involved with MESKLA for inviting me to take part today. Welcome.
Okay, well, Dith da, Jowdy Ovi, a dyworth Reservation in Colonial. I'm Jowdy from Redruth in Cornwall, and I'm a director of the Lowender Peran Festival.
Could you tell us briefly what Lowender Peran is, Jowdy?
Yep, so we're an organisation which celebrates Cornish culture, promotes Cornish culture and its Celtic connections specifically, so those international links.
And Steph, you're working on a book currently, aren't you?
Yes, I've in collaboration with a co-author, an anthropologist, Dr. Max Karachi, and we're going to be looking at Native American encounters, in other words, images made when indigenous people in North America encountered newcomers and what the newcomers made of the native people they saw. So it's a book that looks both ways through the encounter. And I just wanted to say I'm from the Dakota Nation, and I was from Band 1 and 6 of the Oceti Sakowee. That's the bigger group of people that are the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota peoples. So that's where I come from. My ancestry on my father's side.
Thank you both for joining me. I've spoken with both of you about cultural identity and land and the what I'd framed as fractured cultures. And when I started talking about that, I wasn't sure if others identified with that sort of phrase. And then through the project in Plymouth, the Mayflower 400 project, I was able to be introduced to Steph, and it seemed very apparent to me that some of what you were speaking about there was connected to this notion of fractured cultures, and cultures that are fractured by others.
Yes, I think. Do you want me to sort of go into that, or? Okay.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
Well, I think that this idea came through discussions with elders in my community, and that the understanding that when invasion happened and the invader people came to North America, that this set a sort of chain reaction event among all the peoples that caused disruptions, dislocation, diaspora. And so even from the very beginning, through contact with others and their diseases and other disruptions, the imbalances of power, this created what you could call a fracture zone. Some historians have talked about this, a kind of contact zone where things were not as they were before. So in pieces, and that those left were putting those pieces back together even as early as the 17th century, and the things that were happening on the ground in North America. So that's my sort of historical understanding of it.
And it seems that, well, something about perhaps putting pieces together is that then that opens up potential for overlaps and gaps, where I think about a sort of broken piece of crockery and there might be a small aspect that can't be found and is maybe found later and then kind of glued back in.
I think that there were enough memories and enough continuity over, let's say, the last 300 years that have allowed many peoples to reclaim and to reassert their indigenous sovereignties, their indigenous histories and memories. And this is particularly important in the political climate of North America, United States, because you have to establish your nation's presence in a certain area. So for some of the East Coast peoples, this was a real debate, and they had to fight for their what you call federal recognition of their tribes. And this is still going on even today, the fight for indigenous recognition.
I wanted to ask you about the thinking about the book that you're writing and this representation of an other within sort of arts and literature, painting and drawing, how that can dislocate somebody from their own culture and dislocate future generations from their own culture and history. Could you say any more about that, Steph?
I think in the case of my research that there was an early conception of who the indigenous Americans were, and this came partly from sort of a what do you call it, thinking before. In other words, already European mentality, if you like, was forming around what is Europe. So already before Columbus sailed and others, there was a concept, who are Europeans? And so they're forming that at the same time as they're contacting people that they now want to see as other. And so I think they then construct what they were already looking for. So here are people that have darker hair, they have a little darker skin, they look unclothed to a Renaissance European because they have none of the fabulous hierarchical dressing that, say, an Elizabethan at court would understand. So they're naked according to the way they were described and living differently. And of course, there were so many legends about the people to the west of Europe. There were all these legends in European history, even going back, very, very old legends about St. Brendan's Isle and all kinds of fantastic things. So they were looking for this. So I think what's overlaid onto the American Indian people are this kind of fantastical people that live forever, people that have free sex, people that don't have a church. And even by the time of Montesquieu, they're saying sans loi, sans roi, and I can't remember the last one, meaning without laws, without customs, without religion. These people were just literally this kind of essential human being. So this leads into this fantastical structured image of who the American Indian people are. And then looking the other way, when a native person saw the first Europeans, the ships were very different, their clothes were very different. And one of the first symbols that my people, the Dakota, adopted to stand for European people was a hat image. So that hat with a brim often appears on what they call winter counts, which are these histories of the Dakota people, and they have the date when the first trader was seen. And to symbolize that, they use this hat, So that's what they saw as different, and sort of that encapsulate the whole of that experience in that hat. So it's another way of looking at the encounter.
That that idea of that pre-constructed fantastical otherness feels like is still very present, and particularly played out in industries such as tourism. From my perspective, there's an awful lot of fantastical creation of an other experience that could be accessed by the tourist. How do either of you sort of relate tourism to part of that? Those sort of I don't know, that othering, or in being related at all to this fracturing? Jowdy?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, absolutely. And it feels like a kind of a narrative we don't really have control over, or at least it was something that was set by the tourist board, and now we have the internet and we have a little bit more control over it, maybe. But I don't necessarily always recognise the Cornwall that gets sold commercially, if you like. Well, I rarely recognise it, and yeah, I mean, I know, and we've talked before about the sort of idea that Cornwall is somewhere you go back in time, and to go back to something that a sort of slightly purer version. I don't know, before all this immigration and whatever you like, and obviously that's just not the case at all, and that's not my experience of Cornwall and living here. And so and I think and obviously that's with Cornwall being a very popular place to come on holiday, and we know there's a massive problem with second home ownership, and and that sort of fracturing there, and that fracturing of communities, which is, there's been all sorts of fractured Cornish culture over hundreds of years, but the kind of current version of that is very much the housing crisis, I would say. And we've recently been doing a bit of commissioned a bit of research around mapping of intangible cultural heritage in Cornwall, and what people need in terms of support, what those communities need to support those traditions to flourish and continue. And the main thing really coming out was that those communities don't exist anymore because they've been fractured, if you like, because they have nowhere to live, they're moving away. And I moved away. I moved to London. I lived there for some time, and I loved it, and it was great, and I've moved back, and I'm not saying there's any. I think people should go and experience the world, but the idea that you can't live there because you can't afford to live there is something slightly different. And and just how do we support those communities to keep those traditions, and what makes a place is really important.
Well, I think this happened in the United States, more in the Southwest area where the Pueblo and the Hopi people, the Zuni and others live, that it was created as a tourist attraction, and people would go to be sold or to buy items that were made specifically for the tourist trade in that area. But it's also this notion of the land giving you something that you've lost, so that you travel to these places where you get a reconnection. So I think it's people that are searching for that rootedness that a person from an indigenous person, a person born in a location, has that connection, either through history, memory, or just existential living, living in a site for a long time that gives you that connection. But these people coming from elsewhere don't seem to have that with their own location. And so they're searching for that. At least that's the way I would see that. But, I'm one of those people too, because I'm not from Devon and I've come here, but I now see so much more after 30 years. And I think it takes almost that long to have a deep relationship with somewhere, because you have to see everything changing and moving and forming that relationship.
That's interesting there about about the time that it takes, and that searching for a reconnection, perhaps, if that's not present where an individual sort of calls home or usually resides, and most tourist excursions are fairly sort of short in time, but it's interesting to think about that from the perspective of wanting to reconnect somehow with land, or create a space of time, or and there's something there about like we were chatting a bit earlier around climate change and learning to live with climate change and indigenous approaches to land, and we were talking about place thought. Steph, could you just sort of introduce that idea a moment, please?
Yes, this is something I've run across recently in the work of Vanessa Watts and others, an idea that when we talk about nature in our more academic, usual European Western thinking, it's us versus nature, or us in control of nature, or that we are essentially different entities. And I think when we think of place thought, we're giving back to the land and the non-human beings an agency, a voice, and an activity within that dynamic. So it's not just us v nature, it's nature and us in an active compliance with each other, so that it's one of the players, that shall
it really
we say,
does.
in our ways that we want to be in the world and the ways we think. And indigenous people think much more like that, as landscape as an active agent within the histories of our societies and cultures.
And it leads me to think about other extraction industries, such as mining, and a point where the land becomes a resource to be exploited, really, rather than another sort of symbiotic living being that is supporting and like you're in a relationship of reciprocity rather than a relationship of use. And
yes,
and Cornish identity is really bound up currently, or aspects of it are really bound up with mining. And that's partly political. Jowdy, can you tell us anything about that, sort of the importance of mining to Cornish kind of independence and minority status?
Yeah, I suppose it's something I'd grown up with, and mining, yes, that's a very Cornish thing. That's very much part of our history, and I think, and it's so much part of our landscape as well. I mean, when you come home and it's everywhere. The mine shafts are very much part of the horizon. You cannot avoid it; they're everywhere. It's one of the only places, I think, Cornwall, where you could have a piece of history like that right next to a supermarket, and those sort of. But if I'm honest, I suppose it's difficult to connect with on a personal level, because I don't, my family don't come from a mining background. Personally, I suppose, buying a house in Cornwall, you always have to do surveys to check that there aren't mine shafts. And, we're very familiar with radon in Cornwall. It doesn't bother us too much. I mean, those sort of, things that you get used to that might put other people off legitimately. But it is, and I don't know, my school emblem, I think it probably had a mine shaft on it. But beyond that, actually, it's quite difficult to connect with, or on a contemporary level, about what that means today. And there is a little bit in there around it's looking back and how do we look forward around sort of Cornish identity and that idea. It's something we're very famous for. We were at the heart of the Industrial Revolution at one point in time, but actually again for something that is currently destroying our planet. The start of the end, almost, if you like. And so it's a really complicated relationship, isn't it? And it's trying to find, what ways that might become something positive and not extractive in the future, that's going to be so important for the next generation.
Yeah, I mean, I hear that, Jowdy, and I think that we have to see also that human organizations and societies are not able to maintain a balance all the time. That I think that would include indigenous people, that there are times when the balance tips over and we've done too much extraction. So maybe it's part of the just recognizing when the limit has been reached, that we've taken too much out of the earth, and certainly with oil extraction. But there may be an element in which tin mining is needed for certain materials, and that if Cornwall is the place where this happens, that it can be monitored and kept in some sort of balance, between the destruction that it might cause, but also the benefits that come from having tin as a material. So I think it's like we're learning about how to keep these things in balance, and indigenous people have a lot of wisdom about that. That listening to elders and listening to their perspectives about, well, back in the day we did it this way, or we knew when it was too much mining, or we knew when it was too much extraction. We could see that. and kind of trusting that relationship again with the earth and with our land and our landscape.
And there's something around, I'm going slightly off topic, but around the language as well. And one of the things with the Cornish language that's quite interesting is what it can tell you about the relationship with the environment, with the land, and how that's sort of changed over time. So there's a place called Rose near Goonhaven, which it comes from the Cornish word ros for a circle, which is where there's the playing place of Plen and Gwarry, which is where the medieval amphitheatre. And actually, if it had been overgrown, I mean, you wouldn't have known it was there. Sort of understanding through the language, okay, there's something from this that you're that's been preserved through the language. And I was reflecting that I had no idea. So I've always referred to the dunes as towns, which is the Cornish word for a dune. I was about 25 before I realised that the rest of the world didn't call them towns. My relationship with it, was right. That's okay. The towns. So there's something sort of kept within language as well. For me, that's really important about understanding landscape and place.
I had the same experience with language. I think I was almost 40 when I realised Teesy was dialect. No one else. Teesy, to be a bit moody, usually goes with being tired.
Interesting.
I was wondering if then there's, and I have read about this, like the possibilities, if we think about this fracturing and like a distancing through industry perhaps with our relationships with the land, is there the possibility of learning from indigenous peoples about this relationship and paying attention to the land, and when enough extraction has happened and now it's time to stop, is there the possibility for us to perhaps relearn, say in somewhere like Cornwall, those relationships?
Yeah, I think it means pointing the finger at oneself, I suppose, and saying, what are my descendants going to think about me when it comes their turn to take over and make decisions and become the next generation? And we do have a notion called the 7 generations in my people in Dakota. And the 7 generations stands for where you are in relation to those behind you and those in front of you. So you carry with you only, I think, 2 or 3 generations. When you make a decision, you keep those people in mind, but then you also keep in mind the 4 coming. So when you make a decision, you hold all those people together and saying, what is this going to mean if I decide to extract more petrol or burn more fuel? It's something that the indigenous have really highlighted to me anyway in my reading. And how good an ancestor will you be? That's a question a book asked recently, which I just picked up. So yeah, that's a question I ask myself, and it's something you can do right away. You can say right away, I'm going to make changes, and no matter where you are on the planet, you can think about those things.
And we think about like our ancestors then as well in relation to that, and the history of Cornish people, the Cornish diaspora, Cornish miners travelling around the world, being part of that extraction in other lands, a part of that fracturing of cultures and that colonial programme. And I always feel very strongly that there's a real importance to make reparations for that, but also right here in the place, which I think chimes with what you're saying about how good an ancestor will I be? What can I do here and now to honour, acknowledge those pasts and honour those peoples affected, but also honour this moment now and the opportunity we have here now to do something different.
Yes, that's the message, I think, that what that question raises. Yeah.
Do you see that sort of being played out or part of the current activities within like Cornish cultural heritage circles or Cornish cultural circles, Jowdy?
To an extent, I think, but there's probably more to be explored there in the future. We sort of think of Cornwall, it's the diaspora, and aren't we connected across the world, and isn't that wonderful? And yes, but also there is some work to be done exploring why those international connections are there, and and what they've meant for Indigenous people, in those places across the world, and I think there's more to be done there, exploring that and confronting some of it. Definitely.
And perhaps language is part of that as well, like with the reconnection to our language, and perhaps the more we use Canuit Cornish, does that remind us about those relationships and the impact the diaspora had?
Yeah, I think so. It's variety is the spice of life, isn't it? And I think what boring world it would be if everybody spoke English, and it's just a fantastic to have that variety there. And I think it probably makes you more tolerant as well, potentially as a people, or if you do have a wider dialogue, and more languages to express yourself through. I certainly think for me, I've been lucky enough to grow up, and that wasn't through my schooling, unfortunately. The system, by virtue of my family and my parents, really immersed in Cornish culture, I'd like to think has made me actually very open and welcoming of other cultures, very accepting and tolerant, just because I feel quite safe in my own identity. And so I think possibly more of that generally in Cornwall might help, with those difficult conversations about tolerance more widely.
Yeah, I know what you mean. The identity is not something you can necessarily see on people's faces or in their physique. It's in your blood and your bones and your memories and your knowledge, and so speaking the language is just so important. I think it's absolutely the place of reconnection, to be able to name things and start to tell the stories of the place. Those place thoughts are still there in Cornwall. So that reclaiming and reasserting of the sovereignty of the people there that has been so important for North American Indigenous people, and probably South American. That kind of renaming of mountains now, they're renaming rivers after Indigenous names. And this really is such a marvelous decision to do that.
It's happening in Wales, isn't it? I think they're talking about going back to a Welsh name for Snowdon. It just,
beautiful,
really interesting and good. Yeah.
I welcome that very much. Yeah,
it's something that feels like it's been relatively slow in Cornwall, but we are seeing sort of rolling out of bilingual place names and road names, and increasingly bilingual signage for public buildings and in public spaces. I think as that confidence grows, it signals to those here and others like this is what this place is, and we can have confidence in that. It also, I think, on an individual level, helps to give one a bit more confidence to kind of claim that space as well and say, I am Cornish and I'm going to use these words now.
Yeah, I think that's been quite an interesting the sort of the use of the Cornish language has almost in itself been a little bit divisive, and how Cornish are you? Well, can you speak Cornish? Can it sort of becomes this level and slightly, very unhealthy, if you ask me, kind of marker of how Cornish or North of person is. It's divisive, and I think that's reflecting on MESKLA as a project, where that's really interesting, because actually Cornishness is a whole host of different things, of which one is the language, and we can. I'd like to see a place where we can all sign up to that, and sort of understand what it means in its wider sort of. Again, there are those people that feel very Cornish but have no connection to the language whatsoever, and it's all part of the mix, I think, and stepping away from something that that makes it inclusive rather than divisive, I think is really important as well.
Well, I think there was almost a determined effort to repress indigenous languages. I mean, there certainly was in North America. It was almost a governmental policy to take children away from their parents and make them into what you might call U.S. citizens, or take the Indian and save the man was the great slogan that the Indian boarding schools said. And I don't know how it was here, but I heard recently a Welsh person telling me about their family being struck. I mean, physically, what do they call it? Capital punishment, hurt because they spoke their language in school. And that was within modern history, that was going on. So I think this was a determined effort to, I don't know, almost manufacture everybody to be the same, like you say, like we'll all be good consumers, or we'll all be compliant some way, and I think the language is such a defiance, because it's saying, I'm not having your ideas and your concepts. I want my own, formed from the way I was taught by my family, my ancestors, my surroundings, that is a very political act to do such a thing. So I think it's fantastic.
I wanted to touch on in this around language and people's comfort around words that are unfamiliar to them, or perhaps phrases or ways of speaking or being that are unfamiliar. And is there something within this about people wanting to not feel uncomfortable? Like, is that somewhere within, I don't want to say that's necessarily somewhere within all colonialism, but some actions around suppression or repression? We're only going to speak this because then we all understand it, which doesn't actually open up the conversation of how comfortable or how much people understand something, or how comfortable people feel speaking that language, and of course doesn't take into account any sort of anything around neurodivergence or disability. Or
I feel like it's quite an English thing, I suppose. If I may say, but there are plenty of countries around the world that bilingual, trilingual, goodness, where it's really, really common to speak 6, 8 different languages, and that's normal. And I think there are words that you use to express something that don't exist in a certain language, that you need to express yourself, and it comes out in a different way. So I think that's just bonkers, isn't it? The idea that we should all be speaking, or that it's divisive not to. I think it's what a brilliant way of learning about the world. There are things, feelings, like I say, you can't express in English that you can in other languages, that we miss out on. And so like the Towans, I mean, that sort of relationship with the land, and all of that is. I think it's. Yeah, it's that's unfair, just in English, but those countries that are sort of generally monolingual in a way, where the idea of speaking lots of different languages is so foreign, but actually perfectly normal in many places in the world.
Yes, you're right, Jowdy. Bilingual, trilingual is very common, and say a place like the Far East to hear people jumping from the different, Cambodian and into Vietnamese and into Thai dialects, and just being very, and they're not necessarily friends. They've had a history of aggression between those countries, but it's a comfortableness about who you are, perhaps, that allows you to accept. I don't know. I don't know what it is, yeah, about English. I think it's a good question.
Is it then somehow, is it connected to that colonialism, that colonial project?
Well, I can't help thinking that historically, at least, that seriously, that it was an administrative nightmare. I can imagine to have so many overseas territories, so much to administer and maintain, and to have a kind of consistency about your documentation and who could read the treaties. We know that a lot of treaties were not understood by the indigenous people to whom they were addressed, that they were forced to sign. Often one person only was required to sign a treaty, and the whole group were not asked, or didn't understand that what they were agreeing to, or that the people that were signing the treaty or creating the treaty, usually they were British or English or then United States or Canadian with my people, didn't care whether you could understand it and used those documents as means to acquire more land and more land. But land is the big question. I mean, they have a big movement called Land Back in the United States and Canada, which is trying to acquire Indigenous land back that is not being used or is not being developed. And recently, I think in California, somebody was able to acquire a piece of land back for the tribal groups there. So it's sort of, the land is very important to how one can feel indigenous again, to reclaim that sense.
Yeah, that makes well, it makes a lot of sense, obviously, because of that physical space and that space to stand in a place that, like, I certainly feel standing on the land of West Cornwall, where I hail from, gives me a different sort of strength or understanding of myself than any other piece of land, and I can understand something of a space. It certainly, with here, gives me a space to understand myself differently, perhaps more fully.
I think that's really interesting as well, around not just sort of land, I suppose, but buildings. For me, with my fundraising hat on, and I spend a lot of time raising money to buy buildings back for the local communities, and a lot of them in Cornwall are old Wesleyan chapels or Methodist chapels, and of course Methodism being a really strong part of Cornwall's religious identity, heritage and identity, and you see a lot of chapels tend to very lovely homes, that have clearly had a lot of money spent on them, but also that, again, that sense of sort of loss in the community, these spaces, particularly in really rural communities where they could gather together. And so I'm working on 3 projects at the moment, all bringing back, buildings that were community buildings, either, churches or libraries that have fallen into disrepair, or, were at risk of being developed and turned into goodness knows what, flats, pubs, that have, that been saved by the local community. And it's not quite the same as land, but it's that sort of sense of a community space, something that doesn't belong to anyone privately, that anyone can access, and particularly tied up in that sort of heritage of a sense of place.
And do you think, I'm then also thinking about those who come to Cornwall, choose to come to a place, who don't necessarily have an ancestral relationship to it, but also not a personal history relationship to it. So maybe haven't grown up, but then feel very much a connection with a place. Many people make a choice to move to Cornwall and to make their lives in Cornwall and to invest in community here, and speak of a really strong sense of belonging and feeling as though they were coming home. I'm interested in both of your thoughts on that sort of choice to connect to an identity.
Who wants to go?
You go ahead first, Jowdy.
I suppose, again, it sort of comes back to that connection with land, doesn't it? And everyone, whether they grew up here or chose to move to Cornwall, it is be careful what I say, it's not disconnected, it's very well connected, but it's a sparsely populated rural area. It's difficult to move around. When I was living in London and I made the move back home just over 10 years ago, and I went to the popular pub on a Friday night, where in London you'd be lucky to get a seat anywhere at all, on a Friday night, and in Cornwall there were 5 people there and 3 of them were me and my mates. I'm thinking, what on earth have I done, coming back? So there is that sort of, and here I am still quite happy, but it's that you are, it's a way of life almost, by virtue of the landscape and how you live. So we have that shared already, regardless of then your background and the knowledge of the culture. And so I suppose it sort of develops from there, but it is how you kind of connect people into those communities then, and how people contribute to help supporting the indigenous culture, if you like, to sort of flourish, is interesting. How we help facilitate that, I suppose.
Yeah, I agree that it's not maybe so much the person but the place that tells you how to be a good ancestor. But thinking about indigenous North America, that we had a lot of interaction among our different groups, our different nations. We had wars, we had captives, and we had what's called adoption processes. So if someone was taken, say, through war or captivity, they could become a member of another group, another tribe, and they would be adopted officially into that group and would be given maybe even a new name, and had to learn the new ways to be in that place and to be a good person in the society. So it was kind of, in a way, it was kind of a controlled society, in saying that these are the requirements here in this land, in this place. You acknowledge these ancestors and honor these practices. So I think for modern people, maybe they need to see that as well, that they're kind of adopted Cornish, and that if the Cornish people are kind enough to allow them to come in, that they then acknowledge and honor those languages, those practices, and those places that are important and have deep cultural and intangible heritage in that area.
And that intangible heritage, I think that's something that's a really hot topic for us in Cornwall currently. And Jowdy's been undertaking a lot of research in that area. What I find really fascinating about the notion of that intangible cultural heritage is it doesn't necessarily mean a St Piran's flag on the car, perhaps. It might mean a way of speaking, or a bit of dialect, or how you prefer your chips. Can you...
Your cream tea?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's certainly the jam cream debate. Jowdy, could you tell us a bit about that identification of intangible cultural heritage?
Yeah, so like you say, it seems to be the latest thing, isn't it, that everybody's discussing? But I suppose something that we didn't necessarily call it that, but that Lowender Peran has been dealing with for the last 40 years, in terms of celebrating and promoting and connecting to other intangible cultural heritage cultures, and it is by virtue of the fact that it's intangible. It is animated by the communities that own it, and that it has to have people in order to live effectively. You can't put it in a box, or if you do, it belongs in a museum, and it's constantly evolving, and there's all sorts of really interesting hot debates over how much intervention you have, around, because we are dealing with fragments, and the language itself, we don't know how it sounded because we don't have any recordings of it. There are some liberties, if you like, that you have to take to sort of recapture some of that heritage, but it's still important for understanding a place and community cohesion, and it's particularly when it's fragmented, it's quite delicate, and how we sort of bring that back to life. But it has to be owned by those communities, I think, and which sort of comes full circle back to the issue of, if those communities start to be fragmented by lack of access to housing and having to move away for reasons that aren't, exciting ones about expanding your career, but just you can't afford to live there anymore, which is more negative. It has a massive impact, and it causes a really bad feeling, and we start sort of, it's not just fragmented cultures, it's fragmented communities, across Cornwall, but across, the UK actually. And so, yes, I've gone off topic a little bit there, but in terms of intangible heritage, yeah, it is, it has to be lived and breathed. I think that's what's really important about it.
And can it be something, is it recognised as something that might even be a way of being, or turns of phrase, or?
Yeah, so that was quite interesting coming out of the results of the mapping exercise that we did. So we did a light touch. We were looking at where does Lowender Peran go in the future. It's like many organisations post-COVID, having a chance to sort of reflect and think, okay, what do we do in the future, and deciding actually we didn't know, and we needed to do a bit of research around what was going on out there in communities in the sector and how we can support that meaningfully going forward. So we commissioned quite a light touch mapping exercise, which was working out what was going on out there, what groups, what individuals were doing intangible cultural heritage, and what were frustrating their ambitions in terms of taking it forward. And so we did dictate what we meant by intangible cultural heritage, and one of the things that came out of it was actually we missed that kind of just feeling of what it is. And again, even more intangible than a pasty, I don't know. What is it? What does it feel like to be Cornish? And that's that we sort of didn't. It's sort of really idiosyncratic things. I don't know. Someone was saying that it was a Mebyan Kerno conference, and it was the only place they could think of where a political party held a raffle at the end. That was something kind of eccentrically Cornish about that. But how do you capture that? And that I think there were more questions that came out of that piece of research than answers, which was exactly what we hoped for in a way, and we were expecting. But yeah, absolutely capture it. How do you capture a feeling, just a way of being, is challenge accepted.
Well, I can give you an example of a way that a friend of mine and I helped to recapture, I guess it could be an intangible cultural heritage. She's a woman that lives in Morton Hampstead. She's an artist called Melinda Schwackhofer, but she's also Muskogee Creek, so she's a Native American like me. But what we did was we decided to be taught how to tan buckskin as our ancestors would have done in North America, but we found someone on Dartmoor to tell us or to show us. So in that process of actually taking a hide from an animal who'd given its life, we were going to create something very useful and something beautiful out of the death of that animal. So we were scraping that. And in that process, we felt we found mussels that we kind of already knew about, that our ancestors had, which is this action of scraping. And it's all women that do this work in indigenous. So we were talking and laughing and saying, this is where we're in our ancestors' footsteps, you know, and we're in that place. But it was nothing about the land so much as the activity of doing that. So I think it's something, it is very nuanced, but the feeling was what touched us, that we felt indigenous as we were doing this hide tanning on Dartmoor. So it can come in the most unexpected places, is what I'm saying.
And that I think a thing that seems to come across to me more and more is that there's no specific expectation of what that feeling needs to be, or for instance, perhaps it's useful, the mapping exercises are really valuable, but for individuals it's also not a requirement to sort of pathologise one's identity or need to provide that as evidence of sort of to authenticate oneself for the benefit of others.
Yes, exactly.
And that is something that I feel there is a sort of fair bit of, particularly that comes across with Cornishness within Cornwall at present. And it does feel as though that is connected to the things you've been mentioning, Jowdy, around like the housing crisis and tiers of society we now have, and how cultures, communities are being fractured also. Something around who deserves to live in a place or to sort of live in the villages by the sea, for instance.
Absolutely. And you know, and there's interesting well, you know, what sort of Padstow Mayday has, and don't declare to be an authority on this at all, but that it, you know, it's changed and developed so much over the years, and I think there's definitely a feeling of people kind of reclaiming the town, you know, from the outside looking in. It's people coming in, you know, people who live there that now live up on the estates on the outskirts of Padstow, because all of the lovely cottages you see in the town have now got, you know, for rent signs on them over the holidays, you know, and it's that real sense of coming together. And I'm not sure 50 years ago it would have had the same feel, you know. That's evolved as a piece of sort of intangible heritage. It's about reclaiming in a sense. It's just evolved around the world as it is now, and perhaps even more so. Who know, you know, what the impact of the housing crisis is having, but it touches everything, I think, you know, those kind of social issues, and it's reflected back in that heritage as it evolves, I think.
Yeah, it would be really positive to see that all unpack a bit over the coming years, and maybe in some of this research into intangible culture and sort of celebration of those mundane identifiers of cultural identity might encourage or give confidence to many to kind of celebrate that culture, that living culture. I often slip into that using the term heritage because it's so sort of with us and all over the place, but I'm trying to train myself to say it's living culture.
And I think it's interesting when you look at, you know, sort of complicated words like authenticity and, you know, and what it within intangible living cultural heritage, you know, it's the point is you can't pin it down. And actually, if you're looking, well, how do you define Cornish? Well, next week it might be this, and at the moment it's that, but it's actually what the communities say it is, that live with it and live there in a way, isn't it? So, yeah, living.
I was just going to add that I do love that phrase, living culture, because I think it's so true that things are not static and they never were put in a box and held. They were always lived and experienced, and therefore changed by the particular community involved, and very happy to change, to adapt. So that's a really important point. I was just going to add that.
It feels like there's something in this again that is around just a general sort of societal shift or approach shift, the way we view things. So it doesn't need to be, or certainly oughtn't to be viewed in a kind of linear, it is this and then it is this sort of way, and this is the definition, so we all know. In fact, those boundaries and those definitions are always shifting and changing, and a far more, I don't even know what form would describe it, but I made a project a few years ago where I spoke about supple and subtle boundaries, and it feels that this is part of that conversation around identity. In fact, it's always shifting and changing, and sometimes those boundaries become more blurred or more defined than at others, for individuals as well as for communities.
Yeah, very well said.
Thank you both so much. You're both fascinating with so much to say and so much to share, and I'm very appreciative. Miraz?
Whoopie-da, whoopie-da. Thank you. Thanks, Jowdy, and thanks, Sove. It's great.
Miraz, thank you.
Miraz Agas Goslowers. Thank you for listening. Further episodes of the MESKLA Brewyon Drudh podcast can be found on my website, soveberryman.co.uk. That's soveberryman.co.uk, where you'll also find guest biographies and a resource page of links to further reading on the topics discussed. If you feel inspired to join the MESKLA conversation about contemporary Cornish cultural identity, please get in touch with me, Sove Berryman, via my website or social media. You'll find MESKLA Brewyon Drudh on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. The MESKLA Brewyon Drudh podcast and project has been made possible due to a wealth of in-kind help and support from many parties, including Lowender Peran Festival, Gorseth Cerno, Cornwall Council's Cornish Language Office, Coethus Yaeth Canuic, Crescent Cerno, Cornwall Neighbourhoods for Change and Falmouth University Falmouth Campus. The project has been supported using public funding by the National Lottery through Arts Council England, and further funding has been gratefully received from Historic England via Redruth Unlimited. Agas Termin, Agas Quellas. Thank you for your time. See you later.